So I will introduce myself. My name is Brian Kam. I am a writer and researcher and podcaster. I'm working on sort of history of epistemology. So a history of how we know things and how we think we know things and how that's changed over time and across cultures, alongside many other questions in philosophy. But I'm very much an amateur. And I am extremely excited to be joined by you, Professor Brian W. Van Norden, and you are James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College. Your primary area of research is Chinese and comparative philosophy, but you also teach Quine as part of an advanced seminar on modernism, postmodernism, and hermeneutics that you've taught both at Vassar College and Wuhan University in China. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And Quine's an interesting figure because, in many ways, he's solidly in what's called the analytic tradition in philosophy, which is a style of doing philosophy that tries to take inspiration and learn from natural science. But a lot of the conclusions that he arrived at are consistent with what is sometimes referred to as the postmodern tradition in the West.
Mm.
And I should say I've taught him. I have a regular seminar I teach every few years for advanced students at Vassar, but I also had the pleasure of teaching the same course at Wuhan University in China a few years ago.
That's amazing. And I would also love to hear if you think there is a kind of overlap between him and Chinese philosophy. Is that sort of part of the interest, or is that separate?
Well, I got interested in Quine because it just turned out that I did my graduate work in philosophy at Stanford because that happened to be one of the handful of philosophy departments where you could study Chinese philosophy. But it also is a major center for, what's called the analytic tradition in philosophy that really emphasizes issues in natural science, but also the philosophy of language. And
Mm-hmm.
so I got interested in Quine has a thesis called the indeterminacy of translation. He doesn't talk about that in this particular article, but he talks about it in some of his other work. And that's relevant to my work as a translator and an interpreter of Chinese thought. And so that got me interested in Quine's thought. And then I started to read more broadly in his work, and I have broad interest in philosophy in general. So I thought Quine was important to understand because he is one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century in the English speaking world.
Yeah, that's what I'm finding. And I really love that he does seem to bridge this gap between the analytic and continental traditions. Just to talk a little bit about how I got interested in him, I actually I tried to study philosophy. That was my intention as an undergraduate at Princeton, and I actually found it so analytic that I couldn't kind of wrap my head around it, and I just couldn't get along with logic as it seemed at the time. And I ended up taking a Chinese intellectual history class that covered sort of from the early, Warring States period and all that kind of stuff up to the 5th century AD. So I, I went in search of something like Western philosophy and wound up in Eastern philosophy just by virtue of the fact that I was not capable of engaging with the analytical tradition, I guess. So it's kind of funny to be coming to that. And then in terms of this event, I thought I would just say I just put it out on Twitter as a kind of way. I was hoping to get someone to discuss this paper with me, and someone, Saliam Chu, agreed to do so. And then I think I scheduled the event. She unfortunately has had a family thing today, so she hasn't been able to make it. But I reached out to you, Brian, and you were kind enough not only to attend, but to provide me with really, really excellent slides and background on this paper. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, I was happy to do it. I enjoy teaching Quine, even though it's not in my primary area of research. And we'll try. I think we agree. We'll try to make it accessible. So if you're listening and you're not sure, wow, is this going to be too technical for me? I think we're striving to make it accessible to people. And I think it's helpful to understand that part of what happened, the birth of this philosophical tradition that Quine's a part of, the analytic tradition, it arose out of a sense that a lot of philosophy was born out of mistakes in the way that people use language. So people would use language in ways that were weird or unusual, and then they'd arrive at these strange conclusions, or they would argue in ways that weren't logical or that weren't consistent with natural science. So the analytic philosophy tradition grew out of this sense that we want to make philosophy precise, and we want to make it consistent with natural science, and we want to model it on the methods of natural science. And you can understand that motivation, especially if you read some of the philosophy that these guys were responding to. But one of the effects of it was to make philosophy less and less accessible to ordinary intellectuals. And so you get this experience that you had where people are excited by philosophical ideas, but then when they try to understand it, they find that it's incomprehensible, or that people are writing in a style that is ironically obscurantist. And that was kind of the goal of this analytic tradition, was to get away from the obscurantism of earlier philosophy, but it became obscure in its own way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's almost an attempt to reach this point of clarity and precision and accuracy that actually made it so deeply obscure. Is that right?
Exactly. That's the paradox. Yeah.
And so I suppose that starts with Wittgenstein and the sort of logical positivists in the 20s.
Yeah, and there's a really fun book if you want to learn about this stuff, and it's not a technical book. It's a really fun read. The Murder of Professor Schlicht by Edmonds, that came out just a while ago, and I did a Twitter thread where I showed quotations from the book and talked about them. And it's about the murder of a professor. And interestingly, when I mentioned this book to my wife, I said, "Oh, it's about a professor in the early 20th century who was murdered." Her initial comment was, "Oh, was it by his wife?" Which I thought was kind of a weird thing for her to say. But no, Professor Schlicht was a member of this group called the Vienna Circle, which was a group of philosophers who were developing what came to be known by in some circles as logical positivism. And the thing is, the logical positivists were motivated, many of them, by political motives, and so they were opposed to the rise of fascism. And again, they thought that a lot of fascism and far right politics were driven by obscurantism and by a rejection of natural science. So they had a political agenda, which was to ground philosophy in clarity and logic and natural science. And then, by the way, my French bulldog is sleeping at my feet, and he occasionally wakes up to snore or cough a little bit. So if you hear that in the background, that's what you're hearing. So this was the original idea behind logical positivism. And many of the logical positivists had to flee Germany with the rise of Nazism. And so they brought their philosophy to the United States, and it became very influential. And so a lot of American philosophers like the idea of philosophy being modeled on natural science. But then it led to this, first of all, a kind of philosophy became increasingly divorced from politics in the United States, because people thought, well, we're doing abstract theory, we're not doing applied issues. And by modeling themselves on natural science, they tried to model themselves on what they thought was the objectivity of science and its independence from politics. And so a lot of philosophy in the United States became apolitical, whereas the original impetus of the Vienna Circle and logical positivism was very political. People were rejecting what they saw as the obscurantism of philosophy, like Heidegger's philosophy and things like that.
Right. And so Heidegger is seen as kind of, uh, I suppose this is the split between analytic and continental philosophy, and Heidegger is a representative of that continental strand, which could be seen as sort of metaphysical, I suppose, as, in the sense that it doesn't relate to, or it doesn't, it sort of is it's almost like a reversal, isn't it? Because it's supposed to be apolitical, but then it also acquires its own political associations. And logical positivism, which starts out as this progressive program, becomes apolitical by the end. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that. I mean, Heidegger, in fairness, and Heidegger scholars are willing to admit this, they acknowledge this. Heidegger was an actual Nazi. He was sympathetic to the Nazi party, and he did not protect his friends. In fact, he collaborated in removing friends from positions of authority on the basis of them being Jewish. Now, what and I've got a lot of friends who are Heideggerians, and some of them very politically progressive and opposed to fascism. And what they'll say is, well, Heidegger, the person, did some really heinous things, but that doesn't mean that his philosophy is intrinsically fascistic. And and again, the movement that people like Rudolf Carnap is a famous philosopher whom Quine mentions in his article. Carnap was, a very political figure, and he also was a famous critic of Heidegger's philosophy. And he said Heidegger's using these words like being and nothingness, but these terms, although they're terms you can say in English or in German, they don't really mean anything, or at least they don't mean anything the way that Heidegger is using them. So that idea is an intriguing one. But then Quine comes along, and Quine actually studied with Carnap. And in some ways, he's kind of a intellectual descendant of Carnap. But then Quine ends up undermining the fundamental claims that people in the logical positivist tradition had accepted. And in particular, this brief technical essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, denies two of the most fundamental claims the logical positivists had made, one of which is that there are some statements that are true just because of the meanings of the terms in the sentence, like 1 + 1 = 2. And if you ask why is that true, the logical positivists would say, oh, well, it's true because of the meanings of the term one and plus and equals and two. And then there are other statements that are true because we can directly observe facts about the world that show they're true. So the example I use with my students is Van Norden is balding. I stress balding, not quite bald yet, but now how do you know Van Norden's balding? Well, you just look at Van Norden's head and you can see that he's balding. And so this is a way of trying to find a foundation, a firm foundation for human knowledge. There's going to be some claims like mathematics that are true just by the definitions of the terms, and other claims that you can prove are true because you can observe with your own eyes and you can use your ears, all your senses to observe the world and find out they're true. And that sounds like a really attractive view, but then Quine became convinced that this was ultimately mistaken and that these were dogmas, not well-argued claims, just dogmas of the earlier empiricist tradition.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you can kind of sense Quine's admiration, I think, for Carnap's work, right? It's almost like Carnap attempts this pragmatist project, which is just implicit in the earlier sort of sensualists like Hume and Locke, who kind of say, well, we assume that everything's going to boil down to sense experience, which leads to some kind of ideas in the head. but they don't do much work to actually show that that can be done, whereas Carnap does try and ultimately fails. Is that fair to say about Quine's view of it?
Yeah, and Carnap's has this great work. It's sometimes just called the Aufbau, which is part of its German name, but the full name in English would be the logical structure of the world. And Carnap does the hard work of trying to show how you could reduce scientific claims to direct reports of sensory experiences. But the irony is that that Carnap gets about as far as anybody ever did in this project, but Quine points out, but Carnap still fails to succeed. Carnap fails to show us how you reduce all of human knowledge, let alone all of science, to direct reports of sensory experiences. And why do these issues matter? I always tell my students, if you don't know why a scientist is bothered, or if you don't know why a philosopher is bothered by an issue, you don't understand what they're saying. And the reason this stuff is important to these guys is they're trying to find a firm foundation for knowledge. And the suggestion that Quine's responding to is, well, the twin foundations of knowledge are uh, something like meaning. And so there are going to be certain claims that are true just because that's what the words mean. And then there are going to be other claims that are going to be true or false because you can just directly observe that they're true or false about the world. And Quine ends up undermining this sort of foundationalism. And with that, he's really undermining a certain kind of empiricism, a claim about knowledge ultimately being grounded in something like our observations of the world. And so it is some examples of this. I mean, there are people who will say, look, by definition, a woman is a human with XY chromosomes. And they'll say, look, that's just the definition of woman. But Quine is undermining our confidence that there are these necessary truths grounded in meanings of terms. And then if you ask, well, what makes science true? I mean, how do we know that, for example, the Earth is not flat, or how do we know that the Earth is the center of the solar system? You might say, oh, it's by direct observation. But Quine will say, well, the problem is that we don't directly observe anything. We have to interpret the data we've got. And this is why it's possible, even today, for there to be flat earthers, because the flat earthers they know there are pictures of the Earth as spherical from space, but they interpret that data differently. They say, oh, this is part of a, false information campaign that NASA is producing, and that's a way of interpreting data. So how do we have firm foundations for knowledge? It sounds like Quine has undermined what we thought were the firm foundations for human knowledge.
Right. And so those are the two dogmas in this title, right? So there's the first one, which is between analytic and synthetic truths. And so that relates to what you were saying about the claim that certain things are just true by the way the words are in the sentence. Or if we know what each term means, then we know that this is true, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Whereas synthetic truths are truths that are informative, that are not just based on they're based on investigation. Is that right?
Yeah, not just investigation, but a particular kind of investigation using your senses. So that's what synthetic truths are supposed to be. So if you want to know if Van Norden is balding, well, you'd look at Van Norden's scalp, you'd use your eyes, and you'd see that Van Norden is balding. So that's a synthetic truth. But if you want to know that, something like if you want to know that a bachelor is unmarried, to use the classic example from the essays, well, that's if you know what the word bachelor means, you know that they're unmarried. But the problem is when you think about the analytic truth, the ones that are supposed to be necessarily true or just true in virtue of their meaning, we increasingly find out that there are exceptions to them, or that at least they're more controversial among rational people than we would have thought otherwise. I've got colleagues who are logicians, like Graham Priest at the Quine Graduate Center, who deny the law of the excluded middle, which for millennia was regarded as an undeniable truth in formal logic. And the Euclidean geometry was thought for a very long time to be obviously necessarily true, but it turns out that not only are there non-Euclidean forms of geometry, but Einstein showed us that the space we lived in is non-Euclidean, that the space we live in doesn't obey the rules of Euclidean geometry. So this undermines this confidence that there are these necessary truths.
Yeah, I'm so excited that you brought up both of these examples. One is because I have myself kind of questioned the law of the excluded middle and how we wound up in that situation. And so I was very excited to see the link that you sent me, which I can also tweet out after this, about Graham Priest's work on the excluded middle. And also, I think it might be another thing that I got really excited about is this divide between synthetic and analytic truths. It goes back to Kant, right? And Kant, and a little bit before Quine was saying, but Kant is saying that there is a synthetic a priori, and he gives the example of geometry, and Einstein denies this, and basically, it's almost like the only reason I'm bringing this up, I know it may sound a little bit abstract, but I think Einstein's opposition to Kant's position about synthetic a priori truths may have led to some of his scientific work. Would you agree with that, or do you know anything about that debate?
Yeah, it's funny because nowadays many contemporary physicists seem a little contemptuous of philosophy. So like edutainers like Neil deGrasse Tyson, like to mock philosophy. But ironically, the really great philosophers like Einstein and Schrodinger, as in Schrodinger's cat, and Schrodinger was is a Nobel laureate in physics who helped develop the foundations of quantum mechanics, one of the most important physical theories we have. These guys really took philosophy very seriously, and they repeatedly said that if you want to be a great physicist, you have to study philosophy. And Einstein said that reading Hume and Ernst Mach were major influences in allowing him to develop his theory of relativity. And of course, Kant's whole philosophy arises as a critique of David Hume's empiricism. But Einstein said he was actually influenced by Hume's empiricism in rejecting the Kantian view and arguing for a very different worldview, which seemed to contradict the classical Euclidean geometry that had been accepted for millennia in the West.
Yes, and I'm aware Einstein also had a great admiration for Schopenhauer. I think he had a bust of him or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Einstein was until fairly recently, physicists, were very well read and very interested in the humanities. I think the situation we have in the United States, I don't want to go too far afield on this, but the United States, I love my country, but we have a very anti-intellectual country. And one of the things I explain to friends in other countries is to understand America and to understand American politics, you have to understand that Americans generally hold intellectuals in contempt. So now if you're a scientist in the United States, you're a physicist, you're already in a country where intellectuals are held in contempt. And so then instead of embracing the humanities as something, and philosophy as something that can enrich natural science, which really great physicists like Einstein and Schrodinger and Newton and Galileo all made very clear the debt they owed to philosophy, I think a lot of American scientists kind of try to be, fit in by buying into the sort of contempt for the humanities. And they said, well, yeah, I understand why you don't like the humanities, but well, I'm doing science. That's serious, not like this silly humanities stuff. So I think we have this unfortunate situation where a lot of scientists in the West now are kind of knee jerk anti-intellectuals when it comes to the humanities. But the really great scientists are always very clear on their great debt to philosophy.
Absolutely. And I love Schrodinger as well, especially the essay, What is Life, which was a real eye-opener for me. And I suppose this also relates, hopefully this doesn't take us too far afield, to Thomas Kuhn, because he thinks that science sort of has to keep philosophy at arm's length during periods when it's making progress. But as soon as it runs into sort of fundamental problems, what he calls a scientific crisis, then philosophy becomes a really important sort of source of inspiration, really, for the direction that science could take. Would you agree with that? Or
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so, yeah, Thomas Kuhn's major work, as you know, was the structure of scientific revolutions. And he and Quine were working at Harvard around the same time. And I usually have students read Kuhn before they read Quine, just to see some practical examples of some things that help illustrate what Quine was talking about. But yeah, an important idea from Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn was a physics student, and he had to teach Aristotle to undergraduates as part of a survey course as one of the terms for his fellowship. And it made him read Aristotle really carefully. And it led to a kind of intellectual transformation, because Kuhn came to realize that the textbook presentations of Aristotle that he had been taught as a physicist were fundamentally wrong. And so one of the theories that Kuhn developed that I think is insightful is what you referred to, which is that a lot of science is what Kuhn called normal science. And in normal science, scientists are just taught the dominant paradigm of how science works. And then they're expected to just work within that paradigm and not ask any questions. But eventually, scientists will discover enough problems with the dominant paradigm that they realize it can't be correct anymore. And so they have to undergo a paradigm switch where you change the fundamental concepts you operate in terms of. And that is the period of scientific revolution. And during a period of scientific revolution, scientists become philosophers, and they have to consult philosophy and they have to philosophize to invent a new worldview. And this ties into Quine in a certain way because, for example, at the beginning of the modern scientific revolution, when in the Middle Ages in Europe, people thought that the Earth is the center of the solar system, and the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars all go around the Earth. Now, why did they think that? Well, because it feels like the Earth isn't moving, and it looks like the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets are all going around the Earth. And so at the beginning, when Copernicus first offered the heliocentric model, the model that the sun is the center of the solar system and the Earth and the planets go around it, and then Galileo defended that, one of the problems in accepting Galileo's theory was you had to say on this new view that the Earth was a planet. Now we take it for granted that, of course, the Earth is a planet, but actually planet comes from a Greek word planetes, which means wanderer, because the planets were the stars that wandered among the fixed stars. That's what was distinctive of them. So saying that the Earth was a planet appeared to be necessarily false. it appeared to be a violation of the meaning of the word planet to say that the Earth was a planet. How can the Earth be a planet? Look up in the sky. The planets are those stars that wander among the other stars. The Earth isn't one of those things by definition. So, is the claim that the Earth is a planet necessarily false? Well, we believe today that the Earth is a planet, so it's not necessarily false for us. If anything, it's necessarily true. But this is just that issue that Quine's wrestling with is, well, the things that we think just have to be true, are they true just by the nature of the meaning of the words? And if so, how did we make that transition from thinking that the Earth couldn't be a planet by definition to thinking, oh, you know what, the Earth actually is a planet? And you could raise the same question about Pluto, right? When I was growing up, Pluto was a planet, and now we've decided it isn't. Did we change the meaning of the word planet? It wasn't like, I don't think it was just that. I mean, there was a decision that Pluto's not a planet anymore, but partially it was just learning more about how our solar system works and how Pluto is in some ways more like an asteroid and less like a planet. But then we decided to stop calling it a planet. And this just shows that there's a fuzzy boundary between matters of meaning of words and actual observations. And that's part of, Quine's claim. That's my French bulldog coughing in the background, by the way.
That's okay. Yeah, and that whole issue is fascinating because he's saying, well, you can't just say that things are true by definition and then go with that because, lexicographers are coming after the fact and looking at how words are used. And so he says it's putting the cart before the horse to sort of resort to these definitions to clarify issues of meaning, right?
Yeah, exactly. So one way of thinking about it is Quine says, look, there are certain claims that we think just have to be true. And in some cases, if you deny those claims, we're inclined to think, well, you must not understand what the word means. Other times, we're inclined to think, oh, you don't know a fact about the world, and that's why you're denying this thing that seems really obvious to us. But sometimes it's really hard to separate those issues definitively and say, well, look, is this a linguistic issue or a non-linguistic issue? So, for example, people who say that a woman is a human who's got XY chromosomes, there are people who have passed as women their entire lives who have XYY chromosomes or XXY chromosomes. I was talking to a scientist, and it turns out that with modern lab equipment, it's very easy to test your own chromosomes in a college level or university level lab. And so you can check and see, and you might think, well, isn't that a fun, experiment to have students do, sit down and check to see whether they've got XY or, they have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, what do they have? But they don't do it because they know that there are a lot of people who think they know their gender, but they don't have the chromosomes that supposedly go with that gender. And so what I'm suggesting is this issue that you might think is just a matter of definition. Well, isn't female defined as having certain chromosomes? If you actually learn some empirical facts, you discover actually it's a lot more complicated than that. Our conception of gender, when you learn more facts about the world, is more multifaceted than that. Now, this isn't primarily the kind of issue that Quine was interested in, but it's this general issue of how do we know facts about the world and what's the relationship between observation and theory construction. And Quine saying, there's not a clear line between direct observation and theory construction. We're constructing theories about the world which have some empirical content, but we can't just construct a theory out of pure empirical content. We have to theorize about the metaphysics. I mean, what kinds of things actually exist in order to talk about the universe.
Right. And so there's, to come back to this sort of two dogmas. So the first one is this issue of synthetic versus analytic truths. And the second is about reductionism, right? So this idea that you can't sort of boil down sense experiences into any kind of language. And that, as we were saying earlier, Carnap tried very, very hard to do this and eventually kind of uh, it, Quine makes it sound like Carnap himself kind of gave up on that project. And so the second one is kind of a bit more about how do we talk about sense experiences? Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I mean, Quine does a little bit of a rug pull at the end of the essay, so to speak, because he says, well, at the end of the day, these two dogmas are identical. That if you really understand one, you realize, well, then you've got to be committed to the other and vice versa. But one way of thinking about it is in talking about the first dogma, he's especially interested in whether or not there are some statements that just have to be true. They're necessarily true because they just depend on the meanings of words, and he undermines that idea. In talking about the second dogma, reductionism, he's especially interested in this issue of can we reduce claims about the world to direct observation reports? And the thing is, all data has to be interpreted. This is like a commonsensical way of understanding Quine's point about the second dogma. You have to interpret data. And that's why it's possible. It's not that they're correct, but there are flat earthers and people who think the earth is flat. And a lot of things, and sometimes they just make elementary scientific mistakes, but sometimes they're just giving alternative interpretations of the same data. So, and it would be nice in some ways if we lived in a universe where we could just say, look, here's an observation that just once and for all settles this issue. But every observation has to be interpreted. So one of my favorite examples I use with students is I know some people who went to MIT, and they said for a long time the professors who taught introductory physics were really frustrated with the students they were getting at MIT because they kept getting the wrong answer for acceleration due to gravity. And it's like 32 feet per second, and like they kept systematically getting the wrong answer. And so the professor said, look, we're going to show you how to do experiments correctly. So they did the experiments using the same lab equipment the students were using, and guess what? They got the wrong answer for acceleration due to gravity. Now, did you see the headlines all over the world about Newtonian physics falsified? Because turns out acceleration due to gravity near the Earth's surface is not 32 feet per second per second. No, you didn't. Because as soon as they got that result, they said, oh, there must be something wrong with the lab equipment because we know what acceleration due to gravity is. And it turned out that they were replicating a famous experiment that Galileo had performed using a pendulum. And the pendulum, it turns out, was made out of a material that was resisting the movement of the pendulum, and so giving them an inaccurate answer. Now, everything that they did was scientifically correct. They got an answer, and instead of saying, oh, we're going to toss out, this basic result in physics, they said, well, we know the basic result in physics is correct. There must be something wrong with the equipment. And they figured out what was wrong with the equipment. That just illustrates the fact there's no direct observation that proves or disproves a theory by itself. You got to observe, but then you have to interpret that in the light of all the information you have. And so that's the second dogma, that there's no simple experiment that ever verifies or falsifies a claim about the world, because you have to interpret the data. And so that fact, unfortunately, it makes interpreting evidence more complicated than you might have thought it was.
Right. And I think that relates to some degree to Duhame's thing, which is earlier, right? About you kind of can't tell where something has gone wrong in your bundle of theories or set of assumptions going in, right?
Right. And so Pierre Duham is an important philosopher earlier than Kuhn, who anticipated some of these ideas. And Duham points out that all the experimental evidence you've got always underdetermines your scientific theory. There will always be more than one theory that can account for all the evidence you can give. Now, some of those theories might be implausible. In fact, most of them will be, but there will be alternative theories. There are alternative explanations for the results that support Einstein's special and general relativity. They're not accepted by most of the scientific community, but there are alternative theories that make space and time absolute. They're just not considered compelling by most people in the scientific community. And again, this is an important result because it shows that just because you can find somebody who doesn't who has credentials and doesn't accept a mainstream theory doesn't mean that that theory has been undermined, because every theory has some people who are going to reject it. To his dying day, Einstein did not accept quantum mechanics, which is proven to be one of the most successful, if not the most successful, physical theory that anyone's ever come up with. And many of the physicists who developed quantum mechanics, Einstein admired very much, but Einstein just said, I just don't buy it. There's no way this could be true. Priestley is often credited with discovering oxygen. This is an example that Thomas Kuhn uses. But in fact, Priestley did not think he discovered oxygen. He thought he discovered dephlogisticated air to his dying day. Now, why is it's so important that theories have to be interpreted, and so you can always get some people who don't buy the scientific consensus? Well, there are a handful of scientists, for example, who don't believe in global warming. There are a handful of scientists who don't believe that COVID is caused by a virus. And some of them actually have legitimate credentials. If you know the history of science, you realize, well, yeah, that's because all theories are underdetermined. So it's always open to somebody to refuse to accept the scientific consensus. That doesn't mean the theory itself is problematic or that smart people as a group reject the theory. So again, it'd be nice if there were necessary truths that we could rely on that are always going to be true. It would be nice if we could directly observe things that would definitively prove or disprove our theories. But interpretation is always going to be a lot more complex and a lot more disputed.
There's so many things that I would really like to get into. One of them, I'm gonna invite people up to ask questions as we continue the conversation. So if you'd like to raise your hand or request the mic, as I think it's called on here, if you'd like to ask us anything or just join the discussion, please do that now. The thing I was thinking about is this issue that sometimes the harder you look, the less certain you become. And this is something I've observed. I mean, this is kind of what Darwin starts off with in terms of trying to differentiate species and varieties. You know, he comes away like less certain. It sounds a bit like that's what happened to Carnap with trying to set up these logical structures in language. I think Wittgenstein, you know, similar kind of trajectory. And another person who gets a mention in this essay, Charles Sanders Peirce, with the geodetic sort of society. He's trying to do all these measurements. And I think this kind of tends to rather undermine his own view. I mean, even Kuhn says this, the harder you look at the history of science, the harder it is to come away with the idea that it is this kind of consistent, gradual, progressive thing, you know?
Yeah, it's complicated because on the one hand, it is clear that science has these just amazing accomplishments that we have to take seriously. So, for example, I've got a lot of like weird, morbid hobbies, and occasionally I like to check out, graveyards and try to find really old, tombstones, things like that. And I was looking at a local graveyard, and I just saw it was heartrending. It was in the early 20th century. Obviously, an entire family, or almost an entire family, perhaps, had been wiped out by some kind of epidemic. And so you could just see like all these tombstones with death dates near each other, and some 5-year-olds, some 7-year-olds, some 9-year-olds, some older people, all wiped out in one family, their tombstones beside each other. Why don't we see that as much anymore? Like, well, because we vaccinate children now. And so a lot of things that used to kill people don't kill them anymore. Or an earlier generation of scholars, when I first got into academia, had very vivid memories of being terrified of the possibility of catching polio and spending the rest of their lives in an iron lung. Um, and these are things we don't have to deal with anymore, because science has developed things like vaccinations, and science has put humans on the moon. We sent probes from outside our solar system. So in a lot of ways, science has been remarkably powerful at giving us control of the world around us. And Quine, in Two Dogmas, one of the things he suggests is that science is really about predicting and controlling the world around us, and that it doesn't give us a really objective, in a sense, account of the way the world is. It's just a kind of like a developing theory to allow us to manipulate the world in certain ways. And I wanted to make sure we got one of the cooler quotations from Quine out here. I'm reading this. I'm going to edit it a little bit because it's kind of a long sentence. But in section 6 of Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Quine says, physical objects are convenient intermediaries, not defined in terms of experience, but simply posits comparable to the gods of Homer. So Quine is saying that protons, neutrons, electrons, atoms are posits that are comparable to the gods of Homer, in that we don't directly observe the gods of Homer, we don't directly observe protons or neutrons or electrons, but we posit them. And then in order to predict and control our experiences. And then he continues, let me interject that I do believe in physical objects and not in Homer's gods, and I consider it a scientific error to believe otherwise. But in point of epistemological footing, and that's just a fancy way of saying in terms of how you know them, the physical objects and the gods of Homer differ only in degree and not in kind. Both sorts of entities enter our conception only as cultural posits. The myth of physical objects is epistemologically superior to most, in that it has proved more efficacious than other myths as a device for working a manageable structure into the flux of experience. And so that's Quine, who's centrally in this analytic tradition that tries to base everything on science and careful reasoning. And by using science and careful reasoning, he arrives at the conclusion that, well, atoms and electrons and forces and numbers, these are myths. They're just useful myths for allowing us to predict and manipulate reality. And that's a real shocker to find in a serious philosopher writing in this tradition.
Yeah, I love that section. He's saying there's the epistemological footing. In epistemological footing, the physical objects and gods differ only in degree and not in kind. But he's saying that he still is a scientist, and I take this line too, which is that this is the most useful, and that's where it comes sort of back to pragmatism, because it's almost like the same desire for certainty and a single objective truth that eventually will collapse under enough investigation, is what Quine's kind of saying. Also, that same desire for certainty also tends to dichotomize the understanding of knowledge to either say, well, if it's not a single objective truth that we can all point at and agree on, then it's just a kind of relativistic mess and everything is up for grabs. But pragmatism would say that's not true, right? That I think William James says this, that there is a high bar for an understanding, a myth, a theory, whatever you want to call it, to be useful, right? That is not that's not a negligible thing, and you can't just sort of believe whatever you want. Does that?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way of putting it. So it's tempting to say, oh well, look, if we don't have a firm foundation for knowledge, and that's what Quine is saying. There's no ultimate foundation. We're just constructing theories that will allow us to predict and manipulate the world. But again, the gods of Homer and atoms are both things that we don't directly observe, that we posit in order to explain reality. But that Quine does not jump to the conclusion, oh, so anything goes. You can say whatever you want. He says, well, no, in fact, the theory of electricity does a much better job of allowing us to predict and control lightning strikes than does the theory that lightning is a punishment by Zeus. Although both are theories that posit entities we don't directly observe, but each of them, one of them is much more efficacious. And again, if you, my daughter is getting a PhD in bioinformatics, and she did some research into like why do people reject vaccination, and she said, ironically, a lot of people who reject vaccinations have read a lot of articles about vaccinations, but the problem is they're not understanding the articles that they're reading. And so it's not that they've got an equally reliable theory about vaccinations. They are reading a lot. It's just they haven't been taught how to interpret data. And so they don't know what the data they're being given is telling them. And so just because there's no ultimate foundation, that doesn't mean that anything goes. It does mean that we have a lot of work to do in terms of interpreting data, but that's not the same as saying it's all subjective or relative.
Right. And so some, yeah, some are more useful theories than others, or some withstand things. He has this kind of idea of recalcitrance of certain objects in the world, I think. And maybe he has that about theories as well. I think in your slides you have a kind of quite a cool graphic about how he sees sort of it's like almost like a field of
Yeah.
theories, and then on the edges it touches experience. But some of those, metaphysical ideas, that we might have about, you know, I'm trying to think of like one that would be he would put at the center. Can you think of one that would be
Yeah,
very hard to test?
sure. So, well, for example, um, so classically, let's take two claims that we regard as scientific. 1 + 1 = 2, and water is H2O. Now, classically, what you'd say is, well, 1 + 1 = 2. That's an analytic truth because that has to be true. And it's necessarily true. And people like the logical positivists or Carnap would say, well, it has to be true because of the meanings of the terms involved. And then water is H2O. Oh, that's a scientific discovery. That's a synthetic truth. We discovered that through experimentation. But the fact is, both of these truths are very central to our web of beliefs, to use a phrase that Quine doesn't use in Two Dogmas, but does use elsewhere. So the notion that if you ask scientists, give up the notion that water is H2O, they'd say, there's not just one experiment that would lead us to give that up. Just like the scientists at MIT didn't give up the notion that acceleration due to gravity near the Earth's surface is 32 feet per second when they performed some experiments and got a different answer. They said, well, that can't be right. We have to figure out what's wrong with the experiment, because this belief is so central to our worldview that we're highly unlikely to give it up. Whereas my belief that my neighbors have a dog, which they do, I would revise that belief. If I went over there and I couldn't, and they'd moved out and the dog wasn't there, I'd say, oh, I don't have neighbors who have a dog anymore because it looks like they've moved out. But just even like 1 + 1 = 2, again, it might seem, well, surely that has to be necessarily true. Well, kind of, but think about this. In binary arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 10, right? In binary arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 1, 0. So now, again, I can imagine ways one might respond to this, but it just shows you how even mathematical claims that you might think are necessarily true turn out to be more complicated than they'd appeared at first.
That's fascinating, because I was thinking more that certain metaphysical claims, like let's say the existence or non-existence of God, might also be at the center of that kind of field, in the sense that, it doesn't directly contact kind of testable hypotheses, whereas the neighbor and the dog, is much more straightforward. He talks about, that just it's almost like indexicality, or something that you can point to. He talks about the recalcitrance, I think, of certain experiences. So I don't know, would you put metaphysical claims in the center of that field as well?
Right. So what he means, he has this nice phrase. He talked about recalcitrant experiences, and so what he means is, again, the earlier view was to say, well, look, there are claims that we can directly prove by observation. And in response, Quine says, no, it's more like there are claims for which experience is very germane, or there are recalcitrant experiences where it seems like experience is very germane to judging the truth or falsity of these claims, and they're hard for us to account for without changing our theory. So again, if I went over to my neighbor's house and it looked like they completely moved out, there was no one there, their car was gone, everything they owned was gone, the dog was gone, the kitchen was empty, that's a recalcitrant experience for my belief that I have neighbors who own a dog. But Quine says, so we're more likely to revise those kind of claims that are at the periphery of our web of belief, that are near experiences, whereas beliefs that are near the center of our web of beliefs, just by definition, not by definition, but we don't want to give those up. But those include claims like mathematical claims, but also some factual claims about the universe, like acceleration due to gravity near the Earth's surface is 32 feet per second. But you're right, also metaphysical claims like God exists or humans have a soul, those are going to be near the center of the web of belief. So the idea that people like Carnap had was you could show that belief about God or belief about soul was false, because you could say, well, look, there's no experience that will prove you have a soul. There's no experience that will prove you've got that God exists. But Quine is saying, well, that Quine doesn't believe in God, but he says, but you can't argue against God's existence that way, because there's no one experience that will prove that atoms exist. It's just that the web of beliefs that we use works better in manipulating the world if we believe they're atoms. But for some people, the belief that there is a God makes their world work better. And one of the foundational figures of pragmatism, which is a movement that Quine allies himself with, William James famously wrote this essay, The Will to Believe. And in The Will to Believe, William James says, look, you can't prove that God exists, but you also can't prove that God doesn't exist. So if believing in God allows you to deal with the world in a more constructive way, then that belief is justified. And that's a way in which Quine's position, it's not where Quine wanted to end up because he tended to accept the results of natural science, but people inspired by Quine have said, yeah, Quine opens up the door to old-fashioned metaphysics if you can justify it on pragmatic grounds, that your life will be better if you believe in God.
Yeah, and that relates to sort of one of Pascal's arguments in the Pensies. I think it's so funny that you bring up the will to believe because this essay, Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism, was one of four essays that I was considering discussing. Another was William James' The Will to Believe. Another was Herbert Butterfield's Whig Interpretation of History. And finally, Eugene Wigner's Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and Sciences. So we actually have planned to do another space on the will to believe in a few weeks. So if you're interested in attending that, I would love to have you along.
Sure, if I can work it into my schedule, I'd love to do that. Yeah, I was going
Okay,
to
that's
say,
amazing.
if there's a fun example, I thought this was interesting. I was actually raised in a household where I was told growing up that demonic possession was real. I don't believe that it is anymore, but that was part of my spiritual and religious upbringing. So for me, the movie The Exorcist was utterly terrifying because I just been raised. I think, oh yeah, this could happen to you. Again, I don't believe that now, but that's part of my background. But there's a TV series, and I've only seen one season of it, so I can't vouch for it. But the Evil is a TV series that started in 2019, and I only know the first season. But one thing that I thought was really interesting about it was that in the first season, and I won't give people any spoilers, but there's a priest who believes in demonic forces, and there's a clinical psychologist who does not. And they investigate a series of cases. And what's really fun about the first season, anyway, is you're left up in the air about who's right in the series because the priest and the clinical psychologist interpret the same data differently. And as an epistemologist, somebody who studies the theory of knowledge, I thought that was really fun just to see how, again, data has to be interpreted. And again, that doesn't mean there aren't better or worse interpretations. And no, I'm not advocating, belief in demonic possession, but I'm just saying it was interesting from a philosophical perspective to see the first season of the series where they were playing this clever game with the audience where they gave you observations and you as the audience got to share the observations, and then you watch the priest and the clinical psychologist interpret the same observations differently.
That sounds like a really fascinating series. I will definitely have to check that out. I would like to invite anyone up to ask a question. And Isabella, you've come up on stage. Would you like to ask a question or make any comment?
Sure. First of all, thank you for this great conversation. I'm really enjoying it, and I am not at all familiar with Quine's work, so this has been really interesting to learn more. And my question has almost been touched, at least commented on just recently. So you guys are exactly where my head is going, and it's about really the idea of how does Quine think about how we measure the usefulness of theories, right? Because as you mentioned, James, talks about truth is really what works, right? There can be different truths depending on context, and and going back to this example of the television series you're just talking about. My husband's a clinician, and he talks about this incredibly interesting case of one of his clients where the client thought and there was lots of evidence for the fact that he had these dreadful parasites, and he would talk about them and he would scratch at them and there would be lesions and so on, and he would go to doctors and all the doctors say there was absolutely zero evidence of it, and he was absolutely convinced that he had had these experiences. He had gone to countries where he could have got it, And my husband, being the clinician, tries to rationalize, tries to ask for evidence for it, tries to go through this whole experience, eventually getting to the point where he started to believe his client and thought that, in fact, people were not listening to him. We still don't actually know the truth in the end. And what's interesting about it is, where would you figure out what the usefulness of the theory is? You can talk about psychological defenses from one perspective, you can talk about all sorts of things. But I'd love to hear how Quine, if he did, especially since he was using, scientific thought, how he thought about how to measure the usefulness of theories.
Well, that's a wonderful question. And again, I think there's another deep insight Quine has here, which is at one point, well, when I was learning about like theory choice, one of the things I was taught, is pick the simplest theory. And Quine's got two observations about that. He says, first of all, we like the simplest theory, but there are different kinds of simplicity. So, for example, you might have the theory that's committed to the fewest kinds of entities, or you might choose a theory that's committed to the fewest entities, full stop. Maybe there's, fewer entities, but more kinds of entities in another theory. And then he's got this great observation where he says, but the thing is, things like simplicity are more felt than they are judged. They're aesthetic criteria. So we choose theories partially on just an aesthetic sense that must be the way it is. And so now, ironically, and I think you see this in a lot of philosophers, Quine got this far, but he still had a very kind of plodding scientific worldview. And again, I love science, don't get me wrong. If anything, I'm a science groupie, but I think science can't tell us everything. And I think that's part of the lesson to learn from Quine. I don't think Quine learned his own lesson because he was just like, yeah, but science is right about everything. Well, but, if you're right, Quine, then, we should be a little bit more open-minded. So the short answer is, I think Quine saw there isn't any precise way to judge which theory is most effective because you have to weigh these different desiderata. And we can talk about what the things we want are in theory choice. We want to save the phenomena. We want the theory to obey Occam's razor. We want the theory to be simple. We want it to cohere with other theories we've got. But that's all going to underdetermine, as Duhem points out, your choice of a theory. And I'm interested in things related to this, like to give a shout out to another podcast. I often listen to Last Podcast on the Left, and that's a podcast where they talk about true crime, but they also talk about unusual phenomena like UFOs and things like that. And so we've recently learned, just in my lifetime, we've gone from people treating reports of UFOs as a sign that you're either credulous or insane or just a huckster, to having the U.S. government say, yep, no, we've got high quality video of unidentified aerial phenomena. And again, that doesn't prove that these are space aliens. Maybe there's something like some plasma phenomenon we don't understand, but it just shows that there are a lot of things that we might think we understand and think we've got a consensus on that turn out later to be mistaken. One of my favorite examples from history is Lavoisier, and along with many people, early modern scientists, didn't believe that meteorites were real. They didn't think that, no, the idea that there are rocks that fall from space onto the earth is preposterous. And Lavoisier actually wrote a note arguing against an observation of a meteorite, saying, no, it's not an actual meteorite. But now we just take it for granted that, oh, yeah, of course meteorites occur. So the short answer is Quine doesn't give us a way of weighing these different things, and that's why there can be these marginal cases like unidentified aerial phenomena where you could have genuine motivated doubts. But I would just, I would stick to the fact that there are some things that we do know. like we've almost completely eradicated polio because of vaccinations. And although things, people are still dying, we've managed to get a pandemic under control with things like vaccination and good practices that are verified by natural science. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of those facts while trying to be open-minded about the fact that there are theories that might be dismissed that are going to turn out later to be true.
I thought I would read a section of the section 6 that relates to your question, Isabella, that Quine says, total science, mathematical and natural and human, is similarly, but more extremely, underdetermined by experience. The edge of the system must be kept squared with experience. The rest, with all its elaborate myths or fictions, has at its objective the simplicity of laws. And so you can kind of hear the aesthetic quality that Brian mentioned, which is just, it's almost like you're adding an additional constraint onto things. And I think this sense is also quite palpable in Kuhn, who says, in order for us to think something is true of physics, it really helps if it's very simplistic. And he says that mathematics and physics both have this aesthetic constraint on them as well, which is that we don't like having a bunch of extra variables that are seemingly, that maybe account for some edge cases, but maybe make it look a bit messier. And so, and in terms of theory choice, I read an essay of his about theory choice that he gave in, I think, 1973. And he talks about this. It's almost like it's hard to inhabit two totalizing worldviews at once. And so when he has this experience with trying to inhabit the Aristotelian worldview, he has almost like a religious experience, basically. And this is what he sees as the kind of paradigm shift. And that's not to say, again, what we're talking about is like, I'm not saying that it is a religious experience. I'm just saying that the profundity of changing your worldview is so hard that Kuhn sees it as very hard to weigh up these two things. And so a scientist in the midst of crisis trying to see trying to square these new experiences or new observations with the existing one, or to come up with a new framework altogether. These are very hard things to do. And so I don't think there's such a sense, at least in Kuhn, and maybe not in Quine either, that there can be a good metric. I think this is where incommensurability of the worldviews comes up. And yeah, so I don't know, does that relate in any way to what you were asking?
Well, it does, although it's not entirely satisfying for some reason to think of this as aesthetics, especially, although of course I understand the simplicity of theory. I guess maybe what I'm pushing for is also Quine's perspective on the possibility of a multiplicity of theories depending on context, and the extent to which that is seen as having some veracity, right? Instead of some kind of one true way that ends up winning out through scientific inquiry or so on. And if he has, something that's explicitly talking about that kind of ability to not only weigh but hold two or three theories that may have some degree of truthiness, each in a different way. Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
Yeah, I think the perhaps disappointing answer is Quine tends to think in a totalizing way. So ironically, he's gotten us right to the edge of this deep insight, but he's so invested in this earlier way of thinking that privileges the natural scientific worldview that he can't take that last step into a kind of pluralism. The philosopher who does is Richard Rorty. And I also teach Rorty in my course on modernism, postmodernism, and hermeneutics. And Rorty, again, he started as a mainstream analytic philosopher in this mainstream tradition, was very well respected. And then he wrote this book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, which was still pretty well respected and accepted. But then he made this move of saying, that we have to leave this totalizing worldview and this scientific worldview behind. And I think Rorty has a really deep worldview, but I also think that because he was rejected by the mainstream philosophical community, a lot of his later work was a little sloppy. And I think a lot of people who read Rorty don't understand what he's saying. And the people I know who are big fans of Rorty often don't get what it is he's saying. And sometimes fans of Rorty are Rorty's worst enemy. But if you want to know, well, who gives you some more, pluralistic view, I'd say Richard Rorty, and I'd go skipping maybe it's Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature is a difficult book to read. But maybe if you skip towards the end where he gives his hermeneutic alternative to philosophy, and the simplest way to understand Rorty is Rorty says, look, you can understand philosophy as confrontation or as dialogue. And what confrontation means, you can understand philosophy as trying to confront the world, give a theory that accurately describes in a totalistic way the world is. That's philosophy as confrontation. Or you can understand philosophy as dialogue, where it's what we humans living in the web of belief, the conclusions we arrive at in dialogue with each other. And Rorty says, I'm in favor of dialogue. And part of the way he's in favor of dialogue is having a kind of pluralistic conception of how dialogue works, where there could be different forms of dialogue that are appropriate in different contexts. And so you might have one style of dialogue when you're talking about quantum mechanics or relativity theory, and a different style of dialogue if you're talking about reading Shakespeare's Hamlet or The Tale of Genji by Lady Murasaki Shikibu. That's a different kind of dialogue that has different rules about how you discuss things and different goals about what you're trying to achieve.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm a psychologist, and Hubert Hermans talks about the dialogical self, and this really resonates. So I'm very excited to dive into Rorty and think more about this. So thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Yeah, I would like to invite anyone else up who would like to ask a question, or Isabel, I'll come back to you in case you have any more, because we would very much welcome them. I did want to read another section. I was just reading that section 6 today from Quine, and that opening is just also mind-blowing to me, where he says, the totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs, from the most casual matters of geography and history to the profoundest laws of atomic physics or even of pure mathematics and logic, is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges. And this, I think I mentioned to you, Brian, this reminds me of Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, attributes to Max Weber this idea that man is a animal suspended in webs of significance that he himself has spun, or something like that. And so, I like the way that it draws attention to the historicity of these ideas, that even logic has a history. And we can say, one story is that's a discovery story where we find that somewhere. And I think kind of in this part of the 20th century, that story is starting to fray a little bit. And, you mentioned the law of the excluded middle, and that's kind of, I gather, is not so central as it was assumed to be. And it also kind of had a birthplace in time, right? And in a place, in the sense that there was a time before that was an idea, and now it's sort of, I'm not saying it's over, but just that there there is something that I find really important in this idea that we're living in a kind of system of beliefs, and that doesn't mean that all beliefs are created equal. And I don't want to use it to sort of undermine the scientific worldview, but maybe to call attention to the importance of thinking about this kind of malleability, and where it I'm not sure if I can say any more than that. That's just me thinking aloud right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way I think about it is there are different forms of dialogue that are important in different contexts. And I think because natural science has been so remarkably effective in achieving so much, it's tempting to think, oh, everything there is that human beings can know about the world can be revealed by natural science. And it's that last step where I want to get where I want to get off the train. I'm on the train for the yay natural science. You know, natural science is this great technique. It teaches us so much about the world. I'm on board for all of that. And I don't want to contradict natural science where natural science is speaking legitimately about a topic that's under its own purview. But there are other things that human beings can talk about besides natural science. I mean, again, you're not going to, if you want to have an interpretation of Moby Dick, there's not going to be an interpretation of Melville's novel Moby Dick in physics. There's no equation that's going to give you an interpretation of Moby Dick. There's no mathematical equation that's going, or an empirical theory that's going to explain your relationship, you know, with your parents, and, you know, how that conditions your personal and romantic relationships going forward. And sometimes they talk about the thing between Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft in the German tradition, between the natural sciences and the, you know, the science, the knowledge of spirit, you know, which is just kind of one way of putting it, but they're just different things human beings do. And again, natural science, I'm a big fan of natural science, but it does change over time. Newton thought it was self-evident that space and time are absolute. Part of what, and then Kant, in saying that, you know, space and time were, you know, part of they were inescapable aspects of the phenomenal world, in a certain way agreed with Newton, but then Einstein came along and said, nope, space and time are relative to your inertial reference frame. And so science does change over time. And for me, I think the thing to do is to find that space where we can recognize the complexity of interpreting the world and the different ways in which we interpret the world without succumbing to a kind of simplistic relativism, which just amounts to the night in which all cows are black because we can't see or distinguish anything.
Mm. And that brings us back to an earlier point, which is just the importance of philosophy. Because I think what I'm trying to get at is that if we remain sort of closed-minded, or we think only things that are observable matter, you know, this is a thing that we've kind of tried before. And just in this conversation, we've talked about, you know, Kuhn's engagement with Aristotle. We've talked about Einstein, who read Kant extremely closely, and Charles Sanders Peirce also read Kant extremely closely. And so it's almost like, if we take it as a totalizing view and nothing else matters, what do we do when we need to kind of change the theory, you know, that's at the heart of science? If there's not a kind of alternative way of thinking about things, then that may be a cost in the long run. And, you know, just this, and I suppose, you know, within Kuhn, there's also this idea that the theory that you inhabit does also limit your view. I think he gives the example of astronomy in the West, where there's a kind of understanding that the heavens are fixed, and then they fail to see certain things that Chinese astronomers could see much earlier, just because didn't have such strong expectations about what they could see. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is absolutely not opposed to the scientific worldview. If anything, it's about how science can progress when it runs into problems, or when its own theories run out of steam. In Kuhn's terms, when they hit a crisis, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and that example is great. It turns out I have the information in my lecture notes. I don't have it on the top of my head, but in the Middle Ages, there was a supernova that would have been visible to anyone on Earth. And it's a supernova of a star in a distant constellation, but it was so bright that when it got to Earth, you could see it at night. It would have illuminated the night sky for several days. There are reports of it in Chinese sources. There's only one report in an obscure monastery in, I think, what's now Switzerland, that records the event. How did people miss this in Europe? It would have been visible. We know, we can demonstrate scientifically it would have been visible, because the dominant paradigm in the Middle Ages was that there are no changes except for repetitive circular motion, or motion composed out of circular motion, epicycles, beyond the moon. And so therefore, there couldn't be a supernova in space. Whatever was happening can't be astronomically important. So people didn't bother to record it. But in China, they didn't have that paradigm. They thought, oh, yeah, there can be changes beyond the moon. And so they recorded it and interpreted it. So there are a lot of things where you just don't see things if your theory doesn't prepare you for them. And I think that's very important. So why is it so many, especially, but not only, white Americans say, oh, I don't see any evidence of, racism in my country. I don't see any evidence of sexism in my country. And so for many of the rest of us, it's like, oh, no, the evidence is quite obvious that these things are happening. The theoretical framework you bring to the world influences what you observe. And that's the basic point that Kuhn's making with his notion of a paradigm. But it also is relevant to Quine's notion that we have this web of beliefs which only touches experience around the periphery, and you have to interpret data, and you interpret it in different ways. So a random example, I've seen a GIF or a GIF, depending on how you want to interpret that, of King Charles, giving, I guess it was his inauguration address to Parliament, and there's a pen that's in his way, and he looks towards an assistant, and he bares his teeth at the assistant, and gestures to the pen to move it away, because he's just so angry they hadn't moved the pen away. And I interpret this, and I'm like, well, what do you want? This guy's a spoiled brat who's, had everything handed to him his entire life, and he treats ordinary people with contempt because, that's how he was raised. But I've seen other people comment on Twitter and say, oh, you got to cut him some slack. He's in mourning. People who are in mourning sometimes do things that are out of character. And so how do you interpret this? Do you interpret this as, well, this is an extremely privileged person who doesn't deserve his privilege and has learned to treat others with contempt? Or do you interpret it as, oh, no, he's just acting that way because he's so, overwrought with the loss of his mommy. And so, that's why he's acting in a way that I'm sure is uncharacteristic for him. The presuppositions you bring to even something like that influence what you think you're observing.
That's a really good point. Can I just jump in really quickly here, Brian?
Yes,
Yeah,
please
yeah.
do.
So I think one of the things that both of you are pointing to, and Brian, you sort of started with this in this last section with saying why you think philosophy is so important. And one of the things I wanted to also raise that the other Brian is also raising in terms of practicalities of everyday life, and why we still need to not just think and read philosophy, but learn the process of thinking in philosophical terms, is that we need people who can think for themselves well. It almost doesn't matter what theory you end up with, except that you have ended up by doing your own thinking and then engaging with others in this kind of dialogical process. Otherwise, if we don't have this kind of applied philosophy in our everyday life, as we can see in many Brexit cases or American polarization and so on, you get driven into these extremist mobs who are idealizing authoritarians with power and money or charisma or whatever. So we need this kind of critical mass from all over sectors in terms of socioeconomic status, but also cultures and so on all over the world, to think in philosophical terms, to understand the process by which we think of that, rather than just thinking of any one truth or a multiplicity of truths and so on. And so I really like the idea of thinking about how Quine is just bringing up the ways in which we can think about our theories, and especially how they are relevant in terms of language, and how language can be used in such different ways. And just being able to see that, just to have that lens, I think, is so critically important to our everyday lives.
Yeah, I think that that point is well taken. And let me say something that might be controversial, and of course, it's fine if people disagree with this. But I also, in my course on modernism, postmodernism, and hermeneutics, we start off with the classical kind of Enlightenment rationalist thinkers like Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy. We move on to Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Quine's Two Dogmas, Leotard's The Postmodern Condition. And then we usually close with something like either McIntyre's Whose Justice, Which Rationality, or Gadamer's Truth and Method. And one thing that Gadamer talks about is the Enlightenment Era Bias against biases. And what he means by that is that the ideal of the Enlightenment was, well, you never have to approach reality with any presuppositions, because you can just look at the way the world is and observe it, and for yourself you can determine what the answer is. And so, but then Gadamer says, well, if we look at how human knowledge actually works, we don't approach the universe without presuppositions. And that's what Quine is telling us with the notion of the web of belief. And there's nothing wrong with having presuppositions as long as you're willing to abandon some of your presuppositions in the face of what Quine would call recalcitrant experience. So when your experience doesn't match your preconceptions, then you can reevaluate some of those presuppositions. But then that also leads to a kind of moderate and flexible acceptance of authority, because if you ask, well, what concept should I bring to the world? Gadamer would say, well, you should start with the perspective of experts, although they can turn out to be wrong. And I think the weird situation we're in the United States is we went through a period in the post-war, and by post-war, I mean post-World War II era, where people just accepted authority figures without a lot of questioning, and with a certain degree of credulity, because authority figures had led people to, defeat fascism in World War II, and say, well, we can trust the government, we can trust scientists. These are the people who helped us win in World War II. We can trust them. But then we learned the hard way that experts can be wrong too. I mean, experts said that there was nothing wrong with doing nuclear tests in the American Southwest, and then John Wayne ends up dying of cancer that he probably contracted by filming in a desert where there'd previously been nuclear tests. and the experts had said, oh, this is perfectly safe, you don't have to worry about it. Or the experts say, oh, we have to fight a war in Vietnam, it's in U.S. interest to do that. And it turns out the experts hadn't thought very carefully about it and were wrong about the strategic importance of Vietnam for United States interests. So that's led to a real distrust of authority. And now people, they don't believe people who have PhDs. They don't believe people who have MDs. They don't believe people who have spent their entire life studying topics, and they think that they know better than the experts. And the willingness to question authority is of course, an important part of being an intellectual, but also recognizing when you don't know something and when you have to defer to an expert because they know more than you. So when I want to know something about viruses or vaccinations, or I have a question, I go to my daughter who's getting a PhD in bioinformatics. I don't assume that I'm going to understand that evidence better than someone else. Or if I have a question in physics, I go to my colleagues in the physics department and I say, can you explain this to me? Why do you say this is true, or what's the evidence for this? So I think there's a way in which we need this middle way between, we don't want to credulously just accept what every so-called expert says, but on the other hand, we don't want to just reject out of hand what people who conclusions people have arrived at after studying something their entire lives when they've proven their expertise in a certain topic.
Yeah, I love that. You've brought to mind a book that I found extremely illuminating that's on this question of expertise and intellectuals, specifically in the US, and that is Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, where he
Great book.
observes, yeah, these kind of almost like pendulum swings over the course of years. And I think it's written in the sort of mid 60s, and it's so prescient in terms like it explains so much in terms of what's been happening even in the decades since the publication of that. And I think he died not too long after that.
Yeah, it's really striking. Again, I think I said this at the very beginning, but some people might have joined us since then. When I'm especially when I talk to my colleagues in China, I said, if you really want to understand American culture and politics, among the things you have to get are, on average, not everybody, but on average, Americans despise intellectuals and we worship athletes and entertainers. So you think of who are some of the people who have the widest audiences, who comment on current affairs in the United States right now. Well, just off the top of my head, there's Whoopi Goldberg on The View. There's Bill Maher on his show. And there's, I'm blanking on the name, Joe Rogan on his show. These guys are entertainers. They're not intellectuals. They don't have any particular credentials. Joe Rogan is a mixed martial arts commentator and avowed pothead. Whoopi Goldberg is a comic who got one good role that won her an Academy Award. And Bill Maher is a lounge comic whose major artistic achievement is a movie called The Avocado Jungle of Death. And these are people who have massive audiences and get to pontificate on public affairs from different political perspectives. And Plato's critique of democracy in the Republic was that democracy tends to degenerate because the masses don't have any respect for people who are actually wise and virtuous. And Plato predicted that in a democracy, sooner or later, a rich demagogue will come along and convince people that he's on their side and he's one of them. And that will eventually establish a dictatorship. And we've come awfully close to that, I think, in recent U.S. history. So I think I don't have a solution to this, but I think the United States just is a country where we don't respect people with good credentials. And certainly we have to be critical because people with good credentials have made some very stupid mistakes in the past. And I'm often wrong about things. But on the other hand, we just seem to be more interested in listening to what entertainers and athletes have to say. U.S. policy economic policy in the Reagan administration was made by a B movie actor whose major accomplishment was being in a movie with a chimp, and Jack Kemp, a former football quarterback who decided that it made good economic sense to cut taxes on rich people while massively increasing military spending during peacetime. And they said, oh, don't worry, the budget will balance itself because of supply side effects. And this is what we let entertainers, athletes and actors do to our country. Okay, I've gotten kind of controversial here, so I'm sorry if I'm stepping on anyone's toes, but that's my opinion.
No, that's great. Isabella, do you have any other questions or comments? I think we might be winding down.
No, not really. I mean, I wholly agree. So I don't feel that it was controversial at all. I really liked that particular angle of a rant. And there's a lot I think we could still talk about, but I'm just grateful for the conversation and have nothing more to add, really.
And Brian, do you have any sort of closing comments, remarks on Quine or anything else you'd like to add?
Well, if I can give a plug, if you found anything I said interesting, I'd recommend my book, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto. You can get it, wherever you, either online or if you want to support your local small bookstores. That's a popular book I wrote. I think I actually do mention Quine in passing in the book, but it's mostly about general philosophical themes. But there's several chapters talking about the history of philosophy and why philosophy is important in a democracy and the contributions philosophy has made to culture. So if you've been interested in some of those issues, you might enjoy that book. And I just note that one of the best books anyone wrote about the United States was Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And Tocqueville was a Frenchman who visited the United States soon after its founding and had a lot of prescient insights. And one of the things that Tocqueville said was that both the greatest strength, but also the greatest weakness of the United States was that everybody considers themselves the intellectual equal of everybody else. And so on the one hand, that's good because it means that we don't think that in hereditary aristocrats are better either in character or in intelligence from the rest of us. So that's a good thing. But on the other hand, what it means is that we don't, as Americans, don't tend to respect earned status where people actually know a lot because they've studied this topic longer than you have and they've shown their expertise at handling problems in this problem area. And Tocqueville said that a long time ago, and it's one of the most insightful comments I've seen about my country. So anyway, it's a general observation. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you to everyone who's come in.
Thank you so much, Brian. I would love to read Taking Back Philosophy, so I'm very happy for you to plug that book. And I also wanted to plug I think the first article I read of yours, which is the Western philosophy is racist. I think is xenophobic and racist on Eon. That I just think that's such a brilliant piece.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's actually based on chapter 1 of Taking Back Philosophy. So if you enjoyed that, probably enjoy the rest of the book. And I've got a website, brianvannorden.com, with links to both some of my popular essays and also some of my scholarly works. And I also have a long YouTube series on Chinese philosophy, a video lecture series, if people want to learn more about that. But thank you for letting me plug my work so much.
No, absolutely. I will tweet all of those in a thread attached to this event. So thank you so much for this discussion, and I hope we can continue at some point in the future. And thank you for everyone who's listened in. And yeah, I'm doing these spaces every few weeks. The next one, it's not actually scheduled yet, but if you're interested, please get in touch with me on Twitter. That one is supposed to be on William James's The Will to Believe, and that will be probably the end of September. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to end the room. Thanks, Isabella and Brian.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you all.
Hi, thank you.